one thing. Just start with one thing that you actually want. And if you can find that one thing that you actually want, stop and just like sit with that for a second. And then what I really want you to focus on is try to do whatever you can to start that thing in the smallest way possible. Think for a moment about the person that you want to be, not the person that society wants you to be. How do you want to be different? And I'm not saying giving up video games or YouTube or any of that stuff. I'm saying like, okay, so if you want to be a little bit physically healthier, then go for a walk every smallest thing. Do 5 push-ups, do 2 push-ups, do 1 push-up. Whatever that smallest thing is, do something, pick something that you can do and that you can actually be like sort of satisfied with yourself at the end, right? Because now you're actually moving towards something that you genuinely want. Now, if you try to do this, you're going to run into a pitfall. And maybe you're running into it already. And that pitfall is, but it's not enough. So this is where your mind is going to be super sneaky and it's going to tell you like, this doesn't make a difference. Because what difference does 2 push-ups make? Right? We have all this laundry list of things to do. And so we have to be really careful here. And this is like so kind of twisty and sneaky that it's easy to lose y'all. So really try to pay attention to this, okay? When your mind tells you that, the first thing is, what is your mind telling you to do? Your mind is telling you, is trying to convince you that you should want all of this stuff because all of those habits or all of those desires have been implanted within you, right? So it's trying to trick you into telling you that this isn't enough. The other thing that's really interesting though, is that when it tells you those things, what is it actually trying to convince you to do? It's trying to tell you, oh, you can't just do 1%. You need to go 100% or nothing because your mind knows you're not going to go 100%. So what your mind is actually doing in that moment is trying to convince you to do nothing and just continue doing exactly what you're doing because it's doing the cost benefit analysis and it's kind of saying, hey, actually we can get a ton of benefit by just watching YouTube and playing video games every day. So don't bother with that other crap. It never works. We've tried it before, right? And so we know it's not worth it. So you've got to be super careful about that pitfall. Just notice what it's kind of trying to accomplish. Notice that it's kind of trying to keep you stuck. And the reason that it's kind of trying to keep you stuck, because the mind does this really interesting trick, is that it convinces you that you don't want to change. That's what it's trying to do, right? It's saying it's not worth it. And if it's not worth it, then we don't want to do it. And if we don't want to do it, we can continue doing what we're doing. So this is what's so tricky is that sort of lack of readiness actually comes from the mind. There's one pitfall that we have to worry about though. If you pick one thing and you start to do a tiny little amount that is aligned with what you want, your mind is actually going to try to pull a really interesting trick on you. The second you start to move forward with something that you want, your mind is going to remind you of all the stuff that you should be doing because it's going to get all tangled up and it's going to say you should be doing this, you should be doing this, you should be doing this. So doing 2 push-ups a day or walking 15 minutes a day isn't going to be enough. So it's interesting because the second you start to develop forward momentum, the mind will actually trick you by sort of telling you, hey, it's not enough. And what your mind is going to tell you is that it has to be all or nothing. And we can kind of see that in the post. And if you pay attention to yourself, usually when you try to make a change, you try to overhaul your life. So why does the mind do this? Why does the mind tell you that it's all or nothing? Because the mind knows, hey, if I make it all or nothing, this dumbass is going to choose nothing. And if this person chooses nothing, remember it's got that cost benefit analysis running. If we don't bother with all this crap, what do we end up doing instead? We end up playing video games, we end up watching YouTube, we end up scrolling, we end up having a great time, getting a ton of dopamine. And by the way, because we've already done the calculation, right? So if we start to do all of this catastrophic, amazing change, we're going to end up in this place anyway. So I'm looking out for you. That's what your mind is saying. I'm going to save you all the trouble and we're going to jump right to the end of the movie right now. We're going to just retire right here. Right? Because if you're a degenerate who's playing tons of video games and you don't want to change, what are you actually doing? You're retiring at the age of 22. And who wouldn't want to retire at the age of 22? Everyone wants to retire at the age of 22. And your mind is like, hey, you don't need to actually make any money because this stuff is cheap. There's free to play games. We're actually set. I'm going to help you retire right now. All you need to do to retire right now is don't worry about all that crap that you should do. So I'm going to convince you that you don't need to do any of it. So you got to watch out for that pitfall because it's waiting for you and it's what's kept you stuck this entire time. So just to kind of summarize, it's really normal for us to enjoy the life that we have right now because our society is designed that way, right? Games are getting like more interesting. When I was growing up, when I was like 7 years old, 8 years old, you couldn't game 24 hours a day because you had limited access to games. You had to go and buy a cartridge and put it into your Nintendo Entertainment System. You could play that game for 20, 30 hours and then you're done. And then there aren't more games to play. Nowadays, we have an endless amount of entertainment. And then what we sort of tell ourselves is, okay, like, I should do all of this stuff, right? But then there's a part of your brain that's actually playing that tape through to the end, even if you haven't. And it's saying, okay, why should we do that stuff? So we can get more money. Why do we want more money? So we can retire early. Why do we want to retire early? So we can do what we want. What do we want to do? We want to play video games. Why on earth would I waste 30 years when I can actually jump straight to that right now? And this is why we're not ready to change. The other thing to consider is that if we really do want to develop discipline, that comes at a cost, right? Exercising, eating healthy, working hard, those come at very high costs. So how is it that human beings develop the capacity to pay those costs, develop the willingness to pay those costs? That comes from a competing interest. And this is why things are so hard right now, because it's so hard to know what you want. Why is it hard to know what you want? Because the world is brainwashing you to want other things, right? But when a video game company is trying to sell you stuff, they're thinking about their own interests. They don't care about whether you stay at home and, become degenerate. So our society has made it so that we've forgotten or lost the capacity to even know what we want. And so start with that list of shoulds, and parents can kind of do that kind of stuff too, right? Where they tell you, you should look a certain way, you should have this kind of job in society, Instagram and like all these other social media things, magazines, movies, they're telling you you should look a certain way or dress a certain way. So they're shoving what you want at you, but it's not really what you want. It's what they want you to want. And so how do you get around that? There's a really important question you can ask yourself is, even if you don't want to change today, so be honest with yourself. Do I want to change? No. Am I ready to change? No. Do I want to become disciplined? No. So be it. Do you wish you were someone that wanted to change? And if the answer to that question is yes, then come up with a list of all the crap that you should do and try to find a single thing that you actually care about and move one step towards it. But be careful, because your mind will create a pitfall, because it'll tell you it's not enough. We have to do everything. So be super careful about that pitfall of your mind. Really focus on what you want and try to implement the tiniest change possible.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk. Pickaxe.
Every year that goes by, it's harder and harder to be a good Asian kid. And chances are your parents actually don't care. If you look at things across the board, it's harder to be at the top of your class. It's harder to get straight A's. It's harder to get into good colleges. All kinds of jobs are actually getting more and more competitive now. So it used to be that you needed a good degree from an Ivy League institution to get a job at a top tier company like Google. But now you actually don't even need a college degree. And so Asian kids in particular are kind of getting crunched. And we're seeing this in the form of a mental health crisis for Asian kids. The simplest way that this is manifesting is incredibly high suicide rates. People between the ages of 20 and 24, for most Americans, it's actually accidents that's the number one cause of death. But since Asian kids are so freaking careful, right? You guys are not going to put yourselves in accident-prone situations. So actually the thing that you have to be the most careful around is yourself. Suicide rates are incredibly high, and that's just one manifestation of the Asian American mental health crisis. So let's take a look at how some of these things intersect. And we're going to start off by looking at, is it actually getting harder to be a successful Asian kid? And this is where, unfortunately, the answer is yes. So we're going to take one simple statistic. So if you look at medical college admissions tests amongst ethnicities, what you find is that if you want to get into med school in the US and you're an Asian kid, you have to score in the top 23% of pre-med students. So you have to be in the top 23 out of 100 to actually get into medical school. If you're Caucasian, you still have to be in the top maybe 30 to 35% of students who are applying to medical school. If you're Latino, you actually have to be, you can be in the bottom half. So you have to be in the top 54%, which means that you just have to outperform 46 other students out of 100. And if you're Black or African American, you have to be in the top 73%, which means you just have to beat 23 out of 100 kids to get into med school. I want to take a moment to thank our HG coaches. I've taught at a lot of different places and worked with a lot of different people. And honestly, our coaches are some of the best people I've ever worked with. HG coaches have helped over 10,000 people find purpose, direction, and improve their mental health. After about 20 weeks of coaching, the average client experiences a 58% improvement in sense of purpose in life, a 45% improvement in feelings of anxiety, and even a 35% reduction in feelings of despair. And this isn't just me saying this. At this point, we've done this for 3 years, run 6 research studies, and even presented our findings at the American Psychiatric Association National Conference. Over 100,000 sessions later, I can confidently say this works. So if you're interested in checking out HE coaching for yourself, go to healthygamer.gg/coaching to learn more. Now, I'm not saying that this policy is necessarily bad. So there are a lot of things that go into being a good doctor and forming a good application for medical school. And I'll be the first one to say that I think it's a great idea to have a lot of people in medical school who are not necessarily great test takers. There's a lot more to being a doctor than taking a test. At the same time, though, I think it's really important to acknowledge that if you look at it objectively, if you're an Asian kid who's applying to med school, you have to far outperform every other ethnicity. We're talking about some ethnicities that can even be in the bottom half of applicants, or even close to the bottom quarter of applicants and still get into med school, whereas you have to be in the top 23%. So objectively, achieving the goals that your parents may set out for you or that you may set out for you is actually really hard. The other problem that Asian Americans tend to deal with is this idea of a model minority myth. And if you grew up as an Asian kid, you kind of know that people are like, oh, so you're Asian? That means you must be good at math. But the truth of the matter is that Asian Americans or Asians in general are not better or worse at anything than any other ethnicity. Similarly, it's not like Black kids are better or worse or smarter or stupider than any other ethnicity. What we know from a ton of data about ethnicity is that there's a large variation within the population, and that a particular race is not associated with any sort of particular performance. The challenge is that if you're an Asian kid, people measure you up and expect a lot more from you. And that puts a lot of pressure on us, especially when it comes from places like our parents. So we sort of know that Asian kids face a lot of this pressure, and this leads to a lot of stress. The problem is that as Asian kids are facing all of this pressure to succeed, and they don't necessarily have particular advantages at achieving that success, they get kind of crunched and it affects their mental health. It's bad enough that Asian Americans may actually have objective things going against them that makes it hard for them to succeed. But the real problem is that from a cultural perspective and family perspective, oftentimes our parents actually don't give a crap, right? They don't actually care that you're disadvantaged when applying to medical school. They just want you to be a doctor. And so now what we're going to dive into is some of the attitudes that result in this Asian American mental health crisis. The first thing that we're going to talk about is a high pressure for success. So a lot of us have parents who expect a lot from us, right? They actually don't really care about why we can't do something or even what we want to do. They expect us to succeed kind of no matter what. And if you're an Asian kid, it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter what's going on in the world. You should succeed because I think you should succeed. Now, the next problem that we tend to run into, if you sort of look at Asian American cultures, is that we're all about saving face. So if you look at other people who struggle, so everyone's facing the same environment, right? So the world is getting harder for everybody. And then the question kind of becomes, well, if the world is getting harder for everybody, why is it that Asian American suicide is at an all-time high and y'all are number one, or we're number one, right? We did it. We're number one. What's going on there? Why is it that a harder situation in the world is affecting Asian Americans specifically? And that has a lot to do with our culture and expectations. So we're going to dive into some cultural beliefs that make it hard for Asian Americans to get help and therefore deal with all of the problems in the world. The first thing is a very, very high reliance on personal responsibility, right? So like generally speaking, if you're an Asian kid or Asian American, if there's some problem in life, like you're responsible for fixing it, like especially if it's internal, right? Because getting help for stuff, like it's okay to get help for like math tutoring so you can be at the top of your class because you go to Kumon class and whatever, right? That's okay. But any kind of personal deficiency that you have or any kind of struggle that you have, first of all, is equated to a personal deficiency, because if you didn't get an A, that's your fault, right? Forget about the situation, forget about the environment. There's an emphasis on personal responsibility for everything. So there's no appreciation for environmental struggles, like your parents don't care that you're getting bullied, your parents don't care that you need glasses, your parents don't care about any of that stuff. They don't care that you have ADHD, they don't care that you have depression, like that stuff isn't real. Like if there is a problem in your life, you should be able to fix it on your own, right? So that's the first belief that we've got to be super careful about. The second issue that's really, really concerning is a lot of Asian Americans and families care a lot about saving face. So this is also where if you're struggling, first of all, you've got to fix it yourself. And secondly, you better not ask anybody else for help, because what if people find out? Oh my God, you're depressed? Like you better not see a therapist. What if someone finds out that you see a therapist? What if someone, what if you tell someone? No, oh my God, that would be so embarrassing. Because if you were seeing a therapist or if you were getting help for problems, that would reflect poorly on us as parents. That means that we're not raising you right? This other kid down the street, oh, that boy down the street, he's not in therapy and he's getting A's and his parents smack him more than I smack you. Like, what is your problem? We can't let anybody know. And so since there's this emphasis on saving face, it means that you can't go to other people for help, right? Because that's incredibly embarrassing and makes us look bad. Look, what the hell is wrong with you? Not only are you screwing up, now you're going to make us look bad? That's a terrible idea. And the last thing that is actually kind of really unfortunate is that from an Asian American culture, oftentimes we only care about fixing what we can see. So Asian parents especially, like, they're totally fine getting you medical care because there's a broken bone and they can see that the bone is broken. They're totally fine getting you a math tutor because they can see the grade, right? It's a B instead of an A, or a B plus instead of an A, and like that's unacceptable. But if you really look at Asian American parents and culture, we really prioritize things that we can see. And the problem is that with a lot of mental health struggles, you can't see them, right? What does it look like from the outside? Why are you so lazy? Get up. You should get up on time. You need to be studying more. I don't care. You should be sitting there at the desk and learn to concentrate. Just focus. Just do it. Just focus. Just do it. If they can't see it, it isn't real. And this sort of puts Asian kids in an incredibly tough spot because it's difficult for you to have a language to articulate what you're struggling with. And furthermore, since you can't show it to your parents, they don't take it seriously. If you're hearing what I'm saying, hopefully some of this stuff is resonating with you. Hopefully you sort of recognize that the world is becoming a slightly more difficult place. maybe your parents are putting way too much responsibility on you and that you feel a little bit embarrassed or even actively discouraged from seeking help. So what do we do about this situation? Before we get there, I want to start by sort of doing a little cognitive test. So I'm going to say a couple things and I want you to pay attention to your reaction, okay? The first thing is that, hey, it's okay to get help, right? Like, you don't have to live life all on your own. It's like totally fine for you to get help. You should seek help. You deserve help. And pay attention to what your reaction is. If you kind of agreed with me intellectually, like, yeah, like it is okay for people who are struggling to get help. It's not okay for me to get help. I should be able to do it on my own, right? Like, I get that Dr. K is saying that it's okay for people to get help, but I should be able to do it on my own, right? I don't know if I really need help. I don't know if I deserve help. If that was your reaction, that's just a sign that you've been conditioned by this sort of like Asian American culture or Asian culture to over-rely on personal responsibility, okay? So let's try another one. The world is objectively getting harder, right? It's okay that you're not as successful as maybe you quote unquote should be. Maybe actually the level of success that you have right now is appropriate. Maybe the reason that you're not at the top of your class is because you genuinely have a very hard life. What's your reaction to that? Well, let's try this on for size. Yeah, but other people are able to do it, right? So, hey, you're saying, Dr. K, that the world is getting harder, but Sejal is still able to get straight A's? If your mind jumps to comparison and says, oh, but you're saying that everything is getting harder for everybody, I should be doing better. And how do I know I should be doing better? Because other people are doing better. They're able to do it. So why shouldn't I be able to do it? If your mind jumps to comparison, when I talk about, oh my God, things are actually hard for you, and you say, yeah, but someone else is able to do it, that once again is Asian conditioning. Because what do Asian parents do? Oh, this person is getting straight A, that person is getting straight A, this person is getting straight A, and is winner of chess tournament. You got second place in chess tournament and second place in maths, and they are getting number one place in everything. Why can't you be like them? And you can't say, well, maybe because their parents are emotionally supportive and actually help them instead of making them feel small and want to kill themselves. But you can't say that, right? So that's test number 2. Like, what's your reaction when I say, hey, the world is genuinely getting harder and like maybe you're actually doing pretty well for your circumstances. If you turn to someone else, then like maybe that's a sign that you've been conditioned in this negative way. The last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is if I say, okay, you should get help. And let's say that you bypass the first 2 cognitive traps. Then you're going to kind of say, well, it's expensive, right? I don't really know. How do I know it's worth it? Right? Because this is the third thing. I was once reading a paper on psychotherapy of Asian Americans specifically. And there's this really great quote where this one girl is like, every time I go to the therapist, all I'm thinking about is that this is costing my parents $5 a minute. Every minute that goes by, my parents are losing $5, $5, $5, $5. That's all I can think about the whole time I'm there. And am I using that $5 well enough? So if you're thinking about if I tell you to get help and your reaction is, well, like, I don't know if it's going to be worth it. How do I know if it's worth it? So let's think about that for a second, because this I think is going to be revealing. So if you don't think that the help is worth it, sometimes people don't think that the help is worth it because they don't deserve help. Like, how much is this really going to help me? Is this going to help me 10%, 20%, 30%? I don't know if it's worth it. And this is what's really tricky is like, even if it isn't worth it, do you deserve the help anyway? Like, is it worth it for you to go see a therapist? Like, do you deserve to feel better about yourself? Do you deserve for life to be a little bit easier? And this is actually what's so devastating is when we're raised in a culture that places our value as human beings on our accomplishments or relative to other human beings. When your parents say you are worth less than this kid down the street because they got a 4.0 and you got a 3.9. That does something very damaging to your self-esteem. And once you believe that you are not a good human being, then you are less worth investing in, right? Because if there's a 4.0 kid who has a problem, if he's at the top of the class and number one in this and number one in this and number one in this, they're worth investing in, right? Because the return on your investment is going to be so high. But if you're an ordinary Asian kid who has super ordinary expectations on them, then you are going to feel like any kind of help may not be worth it. If you are worth more, then it's worth more investing, right? Makes perfect sense. And this is actually what's so devastating, because this is what keeps Asian American kids from reaching out for help, because they're afraid that they're not going to be worth enough. It's not going to help them enough. And that's what's so devastating about it. And so now the last question is, okay, so like, what do we do about this, right? Because we sort of know all kinds of stuff, that there's Asian American mental health crisis. Suicide rates are very high. By the way, if you look at statistics on like Asian women, for example, they are the number one buyer of self-help books, right? So when they have a problem, it's personal responsibility. I shouldn't tell a damn soul. I'm going to order something from the dark parts of the internet on self-help and dealing with depression and all this kind of stuff, because no one can know. So the first thing that I'm going to say is you should get help. And all of those problems that we just talked about are going to crop up again. You're going to have those kinds of thoughts. Do I deserve it? Oh, like, but what if it doesn't work? Like, all those kinds of thoughts are going to crop up. The next thing to think a little bit about is I'm going to ask you a little bit about what you want. So what do you want from life? Because the challenge here is that if you're an Asian kid, what you want has been like serially beaten out of you your entire life. Because if you're an Asian American kid, if you're an Asian kid, you grow up in a household, and what you want is like the least important thing in the universe. So like if you wanted to learn bass guitar or saxophone, like, what are you talking about, kid? It's like piano or violin. Like, if you want to be a real rebel, you learn the cello, I guess. It's like you got to learn one instrument, you got to do one extracurricular, you got to do math club, debate club maybe, and then you can learn one sport, and they're approved sports. You can't learn lacrosse. You can be like a competitive swimmer, you can learn tennis, like there are a couple of sports that you can do, but you can't do basketball. That's crazy. Soccer, like, I don't think so. Maybe soccer. There's the pre-approved things. And so your whole life, what you want has been knocked out of you. And so what do Asian kids do? They rebel in secret ways. Yeah, my parents forced me to be an engineer, but instead of actually studying, because I can't bring myself to study because I actually don't want to be an engineer, I'm going to just play League of Legends and sit in my basement all day, right? I'm going to skirt by with bees, and then my parents are going to yell at me some, and I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to clam down. I'm going to become a shell of my former self, and then once they stop yelling at me, I'm going to go back to school, and I'm going to try really hard to change my life, and I'm going to keep playing League of Legends. So you're going to have your quiet rebellion. So how do we turn this ship around? Let's start by asking you, what do you want? And the second question then becomes, okay, if this is what you want, are you willing to accept some help in getting it? Because there is a ton of stress. Like, are you okay accepting some help? Notice I didn't ask, do you deserve help? Do you need help? I'm not going to ask those questions because we know what the answers are. Do you deserve help? Well, other people don't deserve it, so why should I deserve it? I don't deserve it because I got C's instead of A's. And the kids who deserve help, or the kids who deserve anything, are the ones who are the model Asian kids. And what about the need question? Did I ask, do you need help? No, of course not. Because if I ask you, do you need help? What are you going to say? Oh my God, it's so pathetic that I need help. I better not tell a soul. It's so incredibly shaming, and we'd lose so much face if people knew that I needed help. So we're going to steer clear of those questions. So the question that I'm going to ask you is, for the things that you want, are you willing to accept help? How long do you want to continue living this way, right? Like, is it worth it? Like, you're not accomplishing your parents' dreams, which, by the way, is why they manufactured you, right? Is to be an instrument of their dreams. And you're not living your own life. Like, you're disappointing them, and your life sucks. So are you willing to consider accepting some help? Because the good news is that help helps a lot. Like, if you're in this situation, I can say this from the bottom of my heart. This is as an Asian kid who almost failed out of college, had less than a 2.0 GPA, and then, was my parents' worst nightmare, which is, oh my God, my Alok has a 1.9 GPA. Oh my God, he's going to fail. And then a decade later, my Alok is at Harvard. Oh my God. I did both. And here's what I can tell you from the bottom of my heart. You absolutely deserve help. You should absolutely get help. Because life isn't a single player game. And the whole point is that your parents can place expectations on you. And even in their way, it's not like they're trying to abuse you, hopefully. They're trying to help you in the way that they know how. But the culture weighs on them too. So it's okay to get help. So I'd say if you're concerned, like if you're having thoughts of suicidality or anything like that, you should absolutely go see a therapist. You should consider getting evaluated for depression if that's a concern for you, anxiety if that's a concern for you. Absolutely go see a therapist. And the point here is not whether you need it or whether you deserve it or things like that. What I'm going to ask you is, what do you want from life? And do you want to continue living this way? If the answer to those questions is no, the answer is very simple. And if you're saying, but I'm not mentally ill, right? Some people are mentally ill and I'm not mentally ill. Well, like, we recognize that, right? And so what I found is that a lot of Asian kids would wind up in my office eventually, especially once I started doing things on the internet. And they're like, oh, this guy understands me. And they'd come in and they'd be terrified that I diagnosed them with mental illness. And if they had a qualified diagnosis, I would diagnose them. Fair enough. We'd start treatment. But what I actually found is that I could help a ton of them too. And that they didn't necessarily need psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy or medication. Does help mean I need to start medication? No, it doesn't. But what I actually help them do is like discover what they want, discover what they care about, help them talk to their parents, help them like learn new skills to navigate life. And it's that piece that we actually like, and then more and more Asian kids started reaching out to me, and then I was getting 10,000 requests a month, and that's like literally why we started a coaching program. Because the problem with life is that people need a lot of help because the world is changing, but not all help is therapy. And it's okay to benefit from help. It's okay to get help from people and it not be therapy. And this is what's so tricky about a lot of Asian American kids is this is what's really bizarre is there's one study I saw recently that showed that over 50% of people who are suicidal are not even mentally ill. And we're starting to learn a little bit more about suicide, which is that a lot of people think about suicide when they don't have a road forward to accomplishing their goals. And so this is the bizarre thing is that even as an Asian American, your conceptions of what help is and what it means and what it indicates about you, all of those can be wrong too. So I'd start by really asking yourself, what do I want? Because chances are that's a voice that you've turned all the way down to mute. Your parents turned all the way down to mute. Do you want to continue living the life the way that you're living it now? Could it be better? And just like you have a math tutor, you can have a mental health tutor. I'd definitely start with a therapist if you're considering suicidality. But and that's why, like, what's the tutor for your mind? Like, what's the tutor for life? That's what coaching is, right? So get some kind of help, whatever it is. And I'm not going to say, I was about to say you deserve it, but I'm not going to say that, even though you do. But I know what that's going to do to you, right? You're going to be like, I don't deserve it. If I had gotten an A, I would deserve it. Don't say that, Dr. K. Don't imply that I have internal self-worth that is not related to my accomplishments. But seriously, just like, who cares whether you deserve it or not? If it's going to help you, go get it.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk. Pickaxe.
All right, so today we're going to talk about how to deal with people who are emotionally manipulative. And this is like such a big problem because there are some people out there who, if you are in a relationship with them, always make things your fault, right? Like even when you criticize them or you're kind of like trying to tell them to, hey, stop doing this, you really need to be doing better. If you say anything to them, like any kind of conflict or even remotely thing that's close to conflict, somehow becomes your fault. So they engage in particular behaviors or like evoke certain feelings in you where they kind of make you feel like crap. And then you're in this weird sort of situation where like every moment that goes by or every day that goes by, they're kind of sitting there and you're feeling like worse and worse and worse. And then you even see that they're doing this to you. You see that like, hey, I'm feeling manipulated. I'm being put into a corner, but you can't like deal with it, right? So the guilt builds up, or you feel like more and more of an asshole, and eventually you kind of give in. And then there's some degree of harmony for some amount of time. But inside you, there's like some amount of resentment building up too, right? Because you were trying to tell them like, hey, this problem in this relationship that we're having, like you're somewhat responsible for it too. But if you ever open that door with them, the emotional manipulation begins again. So they'll engage in particular behaviors or like make you feel a particular way. And then it's almost like they're like bludgeoning you or bullying you using your own emotions. And so you feel out of control and you feel powerless and you feel frustrated. But this is the kind of tricky thing is like, even if you ever try to set a boundary with them, they make you feel like an asshole. And if advocating for yourself in a relationship makes you feel like an asshole or a piece of shit, that is a problem. And today we're going to teach you a little bit about how to deal with that situation, how to understand that situation, how to understand yourself, how to understand them, and literally what to say to sort of level that playing field and help them take responsibility. If you're in a situation like this, you really encourage that person to seek at least a mental health evaluation. Because a lot of these things, it's not that this person is bad, it's that the way that they learned how to relate to their own emotions may be indicative of some kind of traumatic experience in childhood where a therapist could really help them. On the flip side, if you're in one of these situations, you can absolutely get therapy as well to sort of help you manage the stress. But this is sort of why we designed a coaching program to sort of help people understand these kinds of principles. As you go through life, what is it that controls your behavior? What are the things in your life that like you know are wrong, but you can't really fix because there's something internal that gets in the way? So if you really want insight into like, okay, why do I procrastinate, or why do I end up in these situations over and over and over again? Or how do I better understand this balance of, okay, this is what's an appropriate emotion and this is what's inappropriate, and how can I balance those things to move in the right direction? Then definitely check out coaching. So let's start with this. Who are you? You are a good person. You are someone who does not like to feel negative emotion, and you are someone who, when you feel bad about something, you tend to try to do things to fix it. This is what it usually takes to develop a relationship with someone who emotionally manipulates you, right? You have to be like, when you feel guilty or ashamed or angry or something like that, you need to deal with those negative emotions by fixing something in the situation. So if I'm feeling guilty, I can't just sit and feel guilty. I'm not like an asshole who can just be like, screw you, right? That actually bothers me. I can't be a sociopath. So I have to be like, when I feel negative emotions, I have to do something to fix those negative emotions, which means chances are you are a decent human being. Now let's talk about the person that you're in the relationship with. Now this person is not necessarily a bad human being by any means. And I've worked with a lot of people who are very emotionally manipulative, who have like psychiatric diagnoses. And so we'll talk about that in a second. But the most common thing for the person who is emotionally manipulative is a history of trauma. So they may have a diagnosis, may not have a diagnosis. We're talking about things like CPTSD. We're talking about BPD. We're talking about growing up with parents who are narcissistic or abusive. So chances are the person that you're in the relationship with has some degree of trauma. The other thing that we really have to consider is that the way that they manage their emotions is by offloading them onto another human being. So let's take a look at how that works, okay? Here's you, okay? And here's the person you're in the relationship with. And when you're in a relationship with someone, sometimes something happens. There's some kind of conflict or whatever. Like it doesn't really matter what it is. But this person starts to feel some amount of negative emotion. And so as their negative emotion starts to build up, what is the way in which they process or deal with that negative emotion? Now, this is the key thing to understand about trauma. When we have a history of trauma in our lives, or even, it's not like you have to be, assaulted in some way or something like that. It can also be like in a neglectful household. The key thing here is these are people who, when they were growing up, did not learn how to manage their emotions in a healthy way. So what does this mean for you? This means as their negative emotions start to rise, what a healthy human being would do is they'd start to like manage these emotions through stuff like meditation or therapy, or going for exercise, or maybe having a spa day, like going out with friends, and then, like sort of offloading those emotions in sort of a healthy way, maybe playing volleyball or video games or whatever. But that's not what these people do. What do these people do? They transfer their emotions over to you. So as they start to feel bad, they engage in certain kinds of behaviors, or they use words or something like that, that then makes you start to feel bad, right? And so like a good example of this is like, let's say you're dating someone and y'all get into an argument and you're pissed off at them because whatever. You guys get into some kind of argument and they do this kind of thing where they just like start crying, right? And they don't like talk to you. They just start crying. They start to feel bad. Their negative emotions start to rise, and then they don't say anything to you, or they'll say like, I wish that you understood me, or I wish you would listen, or like, I just feel so unloved right now, or like, they'll just say like some random crap. Like they don't even necessarily accuse you. In some situations, it is absolutely like an accusation. We'll get to those in a second. But as this negative emotion starts to build up, like they start transferring it over to you, right? They're like some kind of, I don't know, like some reverse energy vampire kind of thing, where instead of like sucking your negative emotion away, they're like transferring negative emotion to you. It's like some kind of umbilical cord, where then what happens is as you start to feel guilty, right? Then this guilty becomes unmanageable. And like, and this also kind of explains why, I'm so excited about this. So why like every scenario ends up like this. It's because even if both of y'all are fighting, there's this umbilical cord where they are transferring their negative emotion to you, which explains why no matter what the conflict is, you always end up feeling like crap and they're like kind of okay with it. Do y'all get that? Like there are these scenarios where both of y'all are fighting, but something is happening where like the longer the fight goes, the more stable they seem to get and the more unstable you're getting. And that's because there's this emotional transfer of energy. They'll engage in particular behaviors. They'll say certain things that make you feel worse and worse and worse. And now here's the key thing. So since you are someone who does these kinds of things, right? So you manage that emotion through healthy behaviors. You don't just transfer it to someone else. Usually what you end up doing is this emotion gets so much to bear because not only is it like your own intrinsic guilt, which is maybe like this much of it, right? This is your own intrinsic guilt, but then there's the transferred guilt as well. So that what this sort of means is that you like, they'll kind of like, it's almost like a game of chicken where you will experience more negative emotion in the relationship before they do. And then eventually it'll be too much for you and then you'll cave, right? They're sitting there crying. You feel like such an asshole. So then eventually you're like, I'm sorry, fine. And then like you do something like you get flowers or like you make them a nice meal or you apologize or you tell them that you love them. And then what you have to do is take these negative emotions and you got to bottle them up. They get to keep crying, but you don't get to keep crying, right? Or in a situation of like anger, right? If you're with someone who's like emotionally manipulative and is like angry at you, you don't get to feel angry with them, right? You just have to take it and you have to say, yeah, you're right. Or you have to cave and be nice to them or something like that. Like there's something that happens where you end up having to take this crap and you have to manage it. You have to change behavior. You have to appease them in some way. And then you feel terrible about it. So what do we do about this situation? Okay. So a couple of things to understand. The first is what we need to do to fix this situation fundamentally is we've got to stop this like transfer of emotion from them to you. You need to be able to equalize responsibility of fixing the problem in the relationship. Okay? So how are we going to do that? So the first thing that we're going to do is vocalize our own emotions. And then instead of us fixing the problem, we are going to try to encourage them to fix it with us. And I'll give you all an example of what that means. So let's say that I get into an argument and then my partner just starts crying, right? And then I feel guilty and they're like, oh, I can't believe you don't understand me. And then like, they're not like proactive about trying to fix it. Do y'all get that? They're just expressing a lot of emotion and kind of transferring it to you. And it's sort of your responsibility to figure out how to make this better. That's what's so frustrating about emotional manipulation. So instead of what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, I can see that you're upset. I'm feeling upset as well. I know this is important. What do you think we can do to fix this? And this is where they're going to come back with all kinds of other crap that will be emotionally damaging because they don't want to accept responsibility. Why do they need to accept responsibility? Because thus far in the relationship, they've been feeling like crap and they just transfer that crap to you. I'm going to ship you all of my emotional crap and then you're going to pay off that debt. I haven't needed to fix it so far. And that also is sort of not their fault because they probably grew up in a situation where that is exactly what happened to them. So that's the rules of the game as they learn them. They haven't learned how to do like shared decision making or shared problem solving. So instead of what you're going to say is you're going to say, hey, I can see that you're really upset. I'm feeling really upset too. You vocalize your emotions. And then you can say, what do you think we can do to sort of move forward from here? So what you're going to kind of do is dump it in their lap. You're going to say, what can we do? And this is where what you're going to see is an emotional escalation. It's not their problem. It's your problem. So they're going to say, I can't believe you don't understand me. I've tried to explain. If you don't know, this is one of my favorites. If you don't know what's wrong, I don't know how to explain it to you. Right? They'll use phrases like that, which is like, that's so frustrating because like, and so they're going to say things like that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to repeat back to them. You don't want to get emotional. You want to say, I'm hearing you say that, you expect me to understand what is going on in your head and in your mind, and you expect me to know these things. I'm sorry, I don't. Are you able to communicate that to me? And if they say, they're not going to be able to answer that question. They're going to dodge. So be prepared for the emotional manipulation. They're going to say, like, oh, if you don't know what's wrong, I don't know how to say it. And then it's like, what you're going to do is just pause for a second, okay? So some of this is internal. You don't even have to say it. Notice that, hey, they're expecting you to know what's going on with them, but they're the ones who are living it and they can't even articulate it. So why on earth are they expecting you to know what's going on with them if they're the ones that have 100% info and they can't articulate it? So then what you're going to do is you're going to say, hey, until you're able to articulate this, I'm sorry, I'm not telepathic. I think in order to fix this problem, I'm going to need your help. If you're not able to articulate what's wrong, I think I need to take a step back from this. If at some point you're willing to have a conversation about it, please let me know. And then we're going to step back. Then they're going to start crying over and over and over again. And that's when, like, even if they cry, if you leave the room, right, what's going to happen? They're going to start crying louder. This asshole, he's leaving the room and I'm crying. I'm going to show him. I'm going to start crying. I'm going to start, There'll be an emotional escalation, right? And so that's where you can say, hey, I can see that you're getting more and more upset. I don't know how to engage with you unless you're able to articulate what the problems are. I'm sorry you're feeling upset. I'm feeling really frustrated as well. When you've calmed down, if you're able to engage, I really hope you're able to. But the key thing that must happen, must happen, is they must take responsibility for some of their own emotions and the problem solving in the relationship. The key thing for you to understand is that they are going to make you feel guilty. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that guilt that we feel and we're going to pass half of it back to them. We're not going to say all kinds of negative things to them. That doesn't really work well, right? We're not going to say, you don't love me and you did this and you did this. We're not going to do that. We're going to say, hey, I need your help to fix this problem. Are you going to be my partner in this? That's the general approach. And they can emotionally escalate as much as they want to. And then what you are going to say, you're going to articulate this to them and articulate this to yourself. I cannot fix this relationship by myself. There's no way. You've been trying, right? You've been trying to manage their emotions and your own. But if this is a relationship, they've got to be participants. And so as you tell yourself that, just say, hey, like, this is what it's going to take to fix the relationship. I'm going to need their help. You can articulate some of that to them, but you don't have to share all that. But that's how you manage your own emotions. Then you just notice this pattern. Recognize that a lot of what you're feeling is actually being offloaded by them and is not yours to fix. Because the other thing that happens is that when these situations arise, you're left guessing how to fix it. They don't even articulate what they want you to do. So you're just like left feeling guilty, and then you're like trying to play darts with a blindfold, and you're trying to hit the bullseye, and like you don't even know what they want. Right? And so then you're jumping through 1,000 hoops. Whereas if they took some responsibility to tell you, hey, here's what I need to feel better, then it would be like so much less effort for you. But you're left like spinning your wheels and blind and stuff like that. You don't know how to fix it. But you keep trying and you keep trying and you keep trying because you feel guilty, you feel guilty, you feel guilty. And then what ends up happening is oftentimes we'll get so frustrated that we just have to break up with them or something like that. And then that creates a whole other thing where they like start to, escalate even further. And because anytime they feel negative emotion, what are they going to do? They're going to use that emotional umbilical cord to dump it back on you. So just recognize all of this stuff that's going on. And if you want to engage in a relationship with this person, which I know that the internet will say, oh, this person is emotionally manipulative, break up with them. The truth of the matter is that like half the human beings on the planet are in relationships with people who are like emotionally manipulative in some way, right? I don't even have statistics about that. That's just my gut, okay? The key thing, though, is that like a lot of times we don't want to break up with this person because this person isn't like a bad human being. They just don't know how to articulate their emotions. They don't know how to accept responsibility for their emotions. They don't know how to be a partner in a relationship. So what we actually need to do is, if you want to try to maintain some kind of relationship with them, is use this technique, right? First of all, recognize the emotional transfer and then acknowledge their emotions. And then what we're going to do is, instead of like us being omniscient, we're going to admit our failures and we're going to ask for help. Hey, I need your help to figure out like how to move forward from here. How are we going to fix this? So you want to use like first person plural language. And if they're going to come back with all this kind of crap and they're going to say, oh, if you don't know, then I don't know how to tell you. And you can say, yeah, that's really hard for me when I'm in a relationship. You just want to state what's happening. I'm in a relationship with someone who is not able to articulate what they think is wrong. I don't know how to fix that relationship. Period. I can't fix relationships in which my partner can't articulate what's wrong. Period. And then they'll start crying a lot. And then you can say like, okay, I can see that I'm telling you I need help and I'm not getting the help. I'm not getting any communication. I'm going to step away from this situation. And then what you need to do is like step away from a sensory standpoint. You can say, hey, I'm going to like step outside. I love you very much. I just can't function in this kind of situation. If at some point you're able to participate in a conversation, great. I'm more than happy to have it. I don't see I can't fix this without you. Love you. And then you peace out, right? You step away. So if y'all are listening to this, you may start to think, well, I don't think this would actually work with the relationship that I'm in. The emotional manipulation is so strong that this kind of limit setting may not be successful. And so what we're going to do is give y'all a sort of easier option that moves things in the right direction. So the core of the problem right now is that when your partner or the person you're in the relationship with, parent, child, whatever, friend, when they start to feel negative emotions, they displace those emotions on you. Your negative emotions pile up, and then you end up giving in some way. That's why we use the phrase emotional manipulation, because they're changing your behavior. But it feels like you're kind of being pushed into a corner. And these emotions like guilt, or maybe they're crying or they're sad or whatever, they're engaging in certain ways where they're like forcing your behavior. And so this is the other really tricky thing, is that a lot of times what we may sort of think is, okay, if they're forcing you into a behavior, just don't do it, right? Use willpower and resist. Just resist, set limits, set boundaries. But the whole point is that we can't do that. If we were able to resist our emotions, then we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. So instead, what we're going to do is teach y'all a slightly different technique to change the dynamic of the relationship. So the core of the problem here is that you're engaging in behaviors in the relationship without kind of getting credit for it, right? And if you really think about it, they're not really asking you what they want. They start crying and then you feel guilty, and then you're left playing this kind of guessing game to try to fulfill their wants. And even when you do something positive in the relationship, it doesn't feel like a win, right? It still feels like a loss. Even if you do something to help them stop crying or demonstrate your love or provide emotional support, you feel like you were kind of forced into it instead of them like asking you for something and you kind of like doing your fair share. So the tricky thing about this is that even when you do that kind of stuff, it's reinforcing the behavior of emotional manipulation. Because now when they express emotions and then make you feel guilty and then you do the quote unquote right thing, what are you actually reinforcing in the relationship? You're reinforcing them to emotionally manipulate you more, because this is how they get their needs met. And this is what's so infuriating for so many people, is they don't realize, like, how do I get in this situation? Why does this keep happening? It's because you're reinforcing the behavior. Because if emotionally manipulating you gets you to do what they want, they're going to keep doing it. So instead, what we need to do is, if you can't set a boundary or resist, then what we need to do is change the way that they get their needs met. And what we're going to focus on is having them articulate what they want. So the key thing is, it's not that you don't have to do it or you need to break up with them or any of that stuff. You know, if you want to do that, that's your choice. But a lot of people want to try to make these relationships work. And if you want to do that, the key thing is, instead of reinforcing their emotional manipulation, reinforce their articulation. So this is where, as they start crying, for example, you don't want to give in to the crying, but you can say, hey, I see that you're really hurt. Can you help me understand what you need in this moment to help you feel better? Can you please let me know what you think I've done wrong? Or, what can I do? It hurts me so much. So own that emotion to see you cry. I'm really worried about you. Please let me know what I can do to help. So there's something really tricky there. You're not really giving in per se, but you're also not saying, hey, like, I'm not gonna help you. And like, this is your emotions and you need to handle it. So you want to be emotionally supportive, but this is the key thing. You're not gonna do anything until they ask for it. Because what really weighs on people, what really burns people out in emotionally manipulative relationships is that they're left guessing all the time. The other person doesn't even ask you to do anything. They just sort of force you into doing stuff. And so instead, what we want to do is you say, hey, can you please let me know what I can do to help you feel better? And then if they articulate it, you can provide it, right? Presuming it's an appropriate kind of response. And that's really important because what we want to do is shift their behavior. We want to sort of encourage them to actually articulate what they want, and then we can do it for them. The more that you're able to do that, it's going to change the dynamic of your relationship. So now instead of, hopefully, emotionally manipulating you, as you do this more and more, they're able to actually articulate, hey, what you did the other day made me feel neglected and hurt, and I really feel like you should have spent more time with me. I think you should have done this. I think you should have done this. And then that's when you can say, okay, thank you for letting me know how you feel. And now instead of making you feel guilty, they're communicating with you. That still may make you feel guilty, and they may ask you to do things that are a little bit unreasonable, but it's a step in the right direction. So if you're not able to like kind of take a step back and walk away from the conversation, if your emotions get the better of you, this is a technique that can actually work a little bit better. So the tricky thing about being in a relationship with an emotionally manipulative person, and this is the key problem, is that they will like evoke emotions in you, and then you are left managing those emotions and trying to fix the problem. Even if you try to criticize them, or you like sort of ask for their help, or you point out to them things that they're doing wrong, they will somehow activate their emotional circuitry, turn on your emotional circuitry, and make their faults your problem to fix. And this is an unsustainable relationship, and it's incredibly frustrating. But the problem is that we have this vulnerability, right? Because they've learned some really interesting technique, which is this like emotional offloading. So the more negative emotion they experience, they start offloading it to you, which means that their boat isn't sinking. They're taking on some water, but what they're doing is they're taking all the water that their boat is taking on, they're transferring it to you. So you start to sink faster than they sink. So it's like a game of chicken where you have to cave, and you ultimately have to fix this problem. And then the problem is that even when you start to cave and you fix the problem, what have you actually reinforced? You've reinforced that when there is a problem in our relationship, the right way to fix it is to make you feel emotionally worse, right? Because if that person can make you feel emotionally bad and worse and worse and worse and worse until they reach that threshold, then you'll fix it. So this is sort of like, it's kind of like a roommate who like, I'm not going to do the dishes, and you get pissed off about the dishes more than I do, so I never have to do the dishes. All I have to do is wait until you get so pissed off about the dishes that you'll do them on your own. And so this is the frustrating thing about being in a relationship with an emotionally manipulative person, is that you're in a relationship, but you're the one who's kind of like doing all the work, right? It's not like a real relationship where it's a partnership with shared problem solving. It's something where no matter like if you have a problem, they're going to emotionally let you know. And if they have a problem and you try to tell them, they're going to flip it back around on you. So literally what you need to do is recognize this transfer of energy, invite them to participate, and also be able to step away and kind of absolve yourself of their part of it. You can't accept 100% responsibility for fixing the relationship, which is absolutely what happens. You have to accept at most 50% and put the other 50% on them. And if they want to cry about it, that's their choice. You can't make a relationship work for two people.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk. Pickaxe.
Today, we're going to talk about how to overcome feeling intimidated. And this is a pretty big problem. It's not something that people talk about a lot, right? Because it's not like depression or bipolar disorder or suicidality. But unfortunately, it's like a really common experience for a lot of people. You're kind of going throughout your day, and then you run across someone who just feels really intimidating. This is someone that is kind of like maybe they're at work or they're at school or maybe even in a social setting where you meet someone who's just like better than you in some way. And the way that they're talking or the way that they're acting or maybe they're giving a presentation, they sort of evoke all of these feelings of like kind of inferiority. And then what happens is you kind of feel like you don't belong there. You look around and you start to see other people who are like better than you at stuff. Hey y'all, I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world. What I really love about Babbel is that instead of just wasting time on my phone, I'm actually learning another language. It uses sounds, it uses different sorts of images and things like that, and it almost gamifies the language learning process. I also really love that Babbel is built by actual teachers. So these are people that know what it's like to teach people and know what works and doesn't work. The other really cool thing is that their methodology is scientifically validated. So they've done studies that show that you can gain a significant amount of proficiency in as little as 3 weeks. And I've absolutely seen that. So I love Mexican food. I live down here in Texas and I speak some Spanish. But after using Babbel for just a couple of weeks, I found that I can actually order in Spanish far more proficiently. So I'm learning phrases like me trae la cuenta, which means can I have the check please, which is like really fantastic. So it's really easy to learn. So if y'all are interested, check out the link in the description for 60% off of your subscription. And thank you to Babbel for sponsoring today's video. And what does it cause you to do? It causes you to kind of like retreat, right? And then you have these kinds of thoughts like, oh my God, like I don't belong here, or these people are so much smarter than me, better than me, more capable than me. Like I don't know how I ended up there. Sometimes like you even feel some degree of imposter syndrome. I remember this happened to me when I was interviewing for medical school and you're like sitting in the waiting room waiting for your interview with all these other medical school applicants and you make small talk, right? And they're telling you like, oh yeah, like, hi, my name is so-and-so. Like, what's your name? Oh, okay. Like, what are you interested in? I say, I'm interested in this. And they say, I'm interested in this. And I did research in these labs. And then I worked for the United Nations and I like did free surgeries for people in Africa. And they start talking to you about like how amazing they are. And then I start to feel like terrible. It's like, I didn't do any of that stuff. And then I start to feel insecure and then I can't really retreat from it. So sometimes I'm in my own head. So now when I go into the interview, I'm not even thinking about myself and how awesome I am. All I'm thinking about is how this other person is better than me. But in other situations, like social situations, right? You meet someone and they feel intimidating. And what do? You kind of like retreat. And so the real tragedy about feeling intimidated is we have all of these thoughts and then we tend to retreat from those situations. And every time we retreat, life gets narrower, right? Because now I'm not able to go to that party. Now I feel like I don't belong at that place. I can't go hang out with these people because there's this person there who's better than me at something else. And so what happens is our life becomes narrower and narrower and narrower. In the worst cases, we start spending more and more time in front of screens. We're spending more time at home and we feel safe with people who don't really inspire us. Right? So what I sort of noticed in my own life is I started hanging out with people who never intimidated me. And the real challenge is that a lot of the people that didn't intimidate me were not the people I needed to be spending my time with. And so the real tragedy of sort of letting intimidation control you is that it cuts you off from opportunities that you should be engaging in, because those are the people that you actually want as your peers. Right? Those are the people that you want to sort of be spending time with that inspire you towards positive action. But the problem is that they don't inspire you. They just intimidate you. And as an aside, we're not talking about people who are trying to intimidate you. That's a whole different thing, right? We're not talking about someone who's like walking up and getting in your face and trying to like tell you to get the hell out of there and trying to make you feel unwelcome. What I'm talking about is I think the far more common experience of feeling intimidated with a group of people. So let's start by understanding a little bit about what does that actually look like. So sometimes people don't even realize that they're feeling intimidated. And what that manifests as in the mind is you'll have all of these thoughts. Like you'll notice that, okay, this person is so amazing. I'm not as good as they are. I'm not as smart as they are. I'm not as articulate as they are. I'm not as charismatic. I'm not as good looking. So you'll kind of look at someone else and within yourself, you will notice thoughts of deficiencies. The other way to sort of recognize intimidation is you will start to think about what the other person thinks. So you'll think, what will this person think when they see me? This person is so put together and so articulate and so professional. What are they going to see when they look at me? They're going to see someone who's a slob. They're going to see someone who's unprofessional. And so you spend a lot of time thinking about how other people will perceive you in a negative light. But at its root, this is a feeling of intimidation, right? Because they're up there and you're down here. So if you have those kinds of thoughts around people, hopefully we'll be able to help you with that. The second thing to understand is, what is intimidation? So intimidation is something that actually has a very specific set of requirements to trigger in your mind. We actually don't get intimidated by everyone. There's a lot of people out there who are capable of doing things that we're not capable of or not very good at, right? There are people out there who are good at cooking or good at playing video games, but it's not like every person you encounter who is better than you at something intimidates you. There are particular things that we're sensitive to that make us feel intimidated. And this is what's really wild, is what makes us feel intimidated is actually identification with the person. When we see ourselves in another human being, but that person does a better job of being us than we do, that's when we feel intimidated. When we look at someone else and we say, I could do this if I were different. If I was smarter, I would be like this person. If I was more disciplined, I would be like this person. They're just a version of me that's like better than me, right? They're more articulate, they're a little bit better looking, or this person made the right choices when I made the wrong choices. So if I had stayed in school, or if I had chosen to become, not switch into pre-med and stayed in computer science or whatever, if I decided not to go to college and play pro League of Legends or Valorant or whatever. So what we see, what actually triggers the sense of intimidation, this is really important to understand, is not that this person is different from you. It's that for the most part, they're similar, except for one thing. And that is the quality which you feel is intimidating, right? So really think about that for a second, that what gets evoked as intimidation is actually the way that you relate to the person and that you can see yourself in that person, except you're lacking in a couple of different ways. So intimidation is not about that person being different, it's actually about that person being the same. And so the real problem with this is when we see ourselves in someone else and we think to ourselves, wow, I could be that if I ... Our natural reaction is to beat ourselves up, right? Because then you start to look at your life and you start to regret. You're like, oh, I should have done this differently. Or if I had woken up every day, or if I had studied harder, or if I had, spent some time working on my appearance or going to the gym, then I could look like that person. So as we beat ourselves up and we point out our shortcomings, what does that do psychologically? That makes us feel more insecure. It reinforces the insecurity, and the more that we reinforce the insecurity, the more ammo there is for us to be intimidated. And because what is it that's actually fueling that feeling of intimidation? It's actually our own insecurities. And this is why intimidation is so hard to overcome, right? And there may be some people out there that give you answers like, oh, you just gotta do it. You gotta put yourself out there, right? And as you listen to these people who say, just put yourself out there, you're like, bro or girl, I don't think you understand what it's like when I put myself out there. You can put yourself out there because you're different from me. That doesn't work for me. And why is that? It's because when you put yourself out there, you feel really bad. You start to regret even more. You start to beat yourself up, and then it feeds the insecurity. And now you put yourself out there once, and now you're more insecure. So what happens the next time you put yourself out there? It's easier to feel intimidated. And then you beat yourself up again, and then you're like, wow, all these other people can put themselves out there, but I can't even put myself out there. That feeds the insecurity even more, and then you try again because everyone's telling you, just put yourself out there, bro. You try a third time, and each time you go through the cycle, it gets worse. And now it makes sense why you can't put yourself out there and why you think it's a bad idea and why it doesn't work for you, because it literally doesn't work for you. So let's understand a couple of things. First thing to really acknowledge, if you can, but this may actually come at the end, is that if you're there, you deserve to be there. If you get invited to a party and you feel intimidated by other people, you still got invited to the party. So unless you're literally trespassing, right? Or somewhere where you really don't belong. I'm not saying what your mind thinks you don't belong. Unless you're trespassing or breaking the law, you actually belong there. And that's something that I experienced a ton when I started residency at Harvard Medical School. I felt really intimidated. I was like, look at all these amazing people out there. Turns out I'm pretty amazing too, and so are you. And the second thing that we're going to tell you to do may be a little bit scary, but it's really, really effective, okay? So if we think a little bit about intimidation, we recognize a quality in that person that we think is good, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be intimidated by it. They're so articulate. The other problem with intimidation is that we're in our own heads. And you may notice that the more you are in your own head, the worse the situation becomes. Oh my God, what is this person going to think? What should I say? I don't belong here. I should go home. I should run away. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. You're all up in here, so you're not able to enjoy the experience at all. You're not actually able to participate. So what we need to do is externalize your attention. And the way that we're going to do that is going to be absolutely terrifying, but it works really well, okay? So what we actually want to do is express appreciation for the thing that we think is pretty cool. So recognize that when you feel intimidation, the flip side of that coin is actually appreciation, because you're seeing something in someone else that is like a positive quality. That's why you feel intimidated, because you don't have it. So one thing that you can actually do, which is really wild, is walk up to that person and say, hey, I really appreciate ... So if someone gives a good presentation in class and you feel like that person's presentation is way better than yours, after class, walk up to him and say, hey, I thought your presentation was fantastic. I particularly like the way that you did A, B, and C. Now, this may sound absolutely terrifying, and we're going to help you all with that, but let's understand why it works. So I recently saw a really interesting study that if you look at people who are depressed, people who have mood disorders and active depressive episodes, the idea is that normally like they need help, right? So what we should really do is try to help them a lot because they're depressed and they need help. But there's a study that actually found that when people who are depressed help other people, it actually improves their symptoms. So sometimes what we need to do is take that feeling of intimidation and recognize that you can't be intimidated unless you appreciate or respect something about someone. That's the only way that it can happen, unless they're trying to intimidate you, obviously. And so then what we actually want to do is, instead of giving into the negative manifestation of this emotion, what we actually want to do is kind of flip it around and express some appreciation. And you all may have heard about things like expressing gratitude and like changing your mindset and all this kind of crap. This is literally how you do it. You walk up to that person and say, hey, I really appreciate the way that you presented that. That was a really cool presentation. And now suddenly what you've done is you've externalized it a little bit. We're going to help you all if you're all thinking, oh my God, but then what? I can't say that. We're going to help you. Don't worry. Wait with me. Bear with me, okay? So first thing we've done is externalize. We've also engaged with that person. So instead of retreating from it, which causes narrowing of your life and closing of doors and opportunities, we're actually like not being intimidated by it, right? You may feel intimidation, but you can go and you can express appreciation because that's authentic. That's what's really cool. It's not actually being fake. It's actually channeling something that you feel towards this person. Okay, but then what? And that's where you can sort of follow it up with an open-ended question. So you can walk up to someone, you can say, hey, I really appreciate insert quality that I am intimidated by. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose that as a topic? Or, let's say you're intimidated by someone's appearance. I know this sounds kind of weird, but this is something that I've done that works really well. You can walk up to someone at a party and say, hey, you're really rocking that jacket. Like that looks lit, right? And just think about that. How would someone feel if you walked up to them and you said that? Now, if you sort of play it too far, I'm saying say one thing. Don't keep on, oh, and your hair is beautiful, and I love your skin, and I love your shoes, and I love everything about you. You're just so Don't do that. That's terrifying, okay? So just say the one thing. Don't be like verbal diarrhea on them of appreciation. So just say one thing. Hey, I really appreciate this thing. And then follow it up with some kind of question, like that's a rockin' jacket. How did you decide to wear that today, right? Or if someone's giving a presentation, you can say, hey, I really loved the way that you sort of put together that table, or that meme at the end was brilliant. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose this topic? So ask an open-ended question. It shouldn't be a yes or no question. That's really important. And then just ask that. And then it doesn't have to be a long interaction. So here's the other thing, because what people are oftentimes terrified is like, what do they say then, right? And that's where it's like, sometimes if you even go up to someone and compliment them, who's embarrassed now, biatch, right? Because when you walk up to someone, you say, hey, this is a really fantastic presentation. I love that meme at the end. So you just say it with a smile, and then they're like, oh my God, right? And suddenly they're feeling embarrassed, and you've made them feel good, right? Which is pretty cool. And so if you're worried about how to extract yourself from the conversation, you can even just say, hey, so like they say, oh, this is how I chose to put together this presentation. So you ask your question. And then they're going to come back to you, and maybe it'll turn into a conversation, but you're terrified. How do I make it into a conversation? You can't make it into a conversation. You don't need to make it into a conversation. You went there to say your piece. If they engage with you, engage back, right? So we're going to hit the tennis ball across the court. We're going to wait for it to come back. If it doesn't come back, you can say, well, I just wanted to share that with you. Awesome presentation, right? And then you can just walk away. Just extract yourself from the conversation. It's okay. You just walk up and say, hey, I thought you did a fantastic job. Pleasure to meet you. My name is so-and-so. I was curious about this. Thank you so much. And then you just walk out. And so what does this do? This is really important because it does a couple of really key things. The first is it allows us to not retreat, right? This is what's really important. And then we'll develop some degree of tolerance. We're not giving in to the intimidation. The second is that it takes that authentic gap between you and the other person and sort of like that thing that you appreciate about them. And you're actually like vocalizing it and you're owning it and like, that's okay. You're actually engaging with this person. You're also externalizing your attention. And if you need a little bit of help extracting yourself from the conversation, that's totally fine. Some of y'all may be thinking to yourselves, I could never do that. You'd be surprised. Have a little bit of faith in yourself. I've got faith in you. But the other thing that you can do if you're terrified of actually engaging with that person or if the sense of intimidation is too strong, okay, I'm not going to tell you to just do it. I acknowledge that. There's an internal process that you can also do in the safety of your own home, okay, with no one watching, which is I want you to think about, okay, what do I see in this person? Because what you see in that person, honestly, if you really pay attention, you see a version of yourself. And really tunnel down into that and ask yourself, what is really different between this person and me? And while your mind may generate 1,000 different answers, I want you to kind of pick the one that feels the most important to you. Even if your mind comes up with 5 answers, you can write them all down and you can like say, okay, which one is the biggest one? Because one of them is going to be driving it. And then notice that quality and then just ask yourself, right? Because you see the possibility of yourself in that person. That's why you feel intimidated. And so pick that one thing and then ask yourself a second question, which is what is one thing that I can do to move towards that goal? How can I move one step closer to being what this person has? And this is what's really important is oftentimes when we get intimidated by someone, we want to be them. So we don't think about one thing, we think about the 1,000 different things that I need to do before I become what that person is. And that's where you've got to be a little bit careful. Don't worry about the 1,000 things. Your mind may tell you, oh, there's no way you can ever get there because there's so many things that are different. Instead, pick one thing and ask yourself, okay, so this person was articulate. What can I do to be more articulate? Maybe I should practice my presentations for 15 minutes before I give them, okay? So you really try to tunnel it down into one thing and implement that one thing. The really cool thing is when you do that, not only do you become more articulate because you're practicing and you're intentional, but the other really cool thing is instead of just being like weighed down by this intimidation or retreating from it, you're actually improving in some small way. And as you start to improve in some small way, we're going to start to see the reverse cycle, where now instead of like feeding your insecurity and feeling more intimidated, you'll start to develop a tiny bit of confidence. As you start to develop a tiny bit of confidence, as you re-engage with people, you'll be more comfortable being there. As you're more comfortable being there, you start to enjoy it a little bit more because you're comfortable, and that's why we don't like it, because we're uncomfortable. And then as you're able to be there a little bit more, you'll see the reverse of the vicious cycle, where now you're more comfortable and you're hanging out with them, you start to form relationships. Now the next time you think about going, it isn't as scary to go the second time and the third time, and each time you kind of do this process, you will get a little bit better. So it's really unfortunate that oftentimes we feel really intimidated by people who aren't even trying. We're walking around going about our business and we enter into situations where we see people who are smarter than us, more articulate than us, more attractive than us, more physically in shape than us, more knowledgeable than us. We walk around the world and our mind sees all kinds of things. And when we feel that intimidation, it manifests as all these thoughts like, oh my God, like this person is so much better than me or whatever. Or you start to think about what they will see when they look at me. Oh my God, what is this person going to think? I am so pathetic. I'm so not put together. They're so put together. And if you notice, there's a comparison. And the reason that you feel intimidated is actually because you see a version of yourself in that person. This person has accomplished what you could have done if you had made different choices or were a slightly different human being. If you were more disciplined and lived up to your potential, then you could be that person. And so when you see that person, you see your own regret. And that's what your mind actually tries to retreat from. Because if you think about why does the mind retreat when we feel intimidated, it's to try to protect us from feeling that regret that we see when we encounter that other person. And if we move away from the other person, then there's no regret. The challenge is that as we move away from that person, we start to narrow the scope of our life. Doors start to close because now I can't go to that entrepreneurship conference. Now I can't go to this extracurricular activity. I can't go to this party. I can't apply for this job interview. And so our life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it becomes more and more insecure, right? Because we have fewer things to be proud of and the whole cycle repeats itself. So instead, recognize that actually the reason that you feel intimidated is because you are capable of what the other person is. You just need to make some changes. And in the short term, one thing that you can really do to avoid that retreat and avoid getting trapped in your own head is just express appreciation towards that person. Even if it's a little bit uncomfortable for you, certainly makes their day, right? So like, that's pretty cool. And acknowledge that, hey, I really appreciate this thing. That's why I feel intimidated. You don't have to share that, right? So you just walk up to them and say, hey, I really appreciate this. Follow it up with a question. And if they choose not to engage with you because maybe they're embarrassed by the positive feedback and they don't know what to say, then you can say, hey, I just wanted to share that. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. It was nice to meet you. And then you walk away. And even if that is scary, you can go through this introspective process of recognizing, okay, what do I see in this other person? And how can I take one step towards that? Don't try to become the other person, but what can I do? Just one step forward that'll help me move towards this goal because I know I'm capable. If you didn't know you were capable, you wouldn't be intimidated by it in the first place.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk.
Of the video, but if you get the urge to switch off, the way that you manage that urge will actually be really, really important data that will sort of prove the point and really teach you how to use this principle. In order to get started, we have to understand two things about the mind. The first is that the mind is very curious and likes to engage with new things, which I'm sure you understand, right? So these new things, whether it's new TV shows or even like learning particular instruments or whatever, it gets excited about that stuff. And once it gets excited, if it engages with that stuff, there may be some kind of dopamine release or something like that. The second thing to understand about the mind is that it develops tolerance to any kind of stimuli. So this is something that you can understand very simply by like when you put on your shirt in the morning, you feel the shirt when you first put it on, but then you acclimatize to it. Right? Even when you go into something like a public restroom, it smells really bad for the first few seconds that you're there, but the longer you stay in the restroom, the more tolerable the scent becomes. And this also happens with dopaminergic stuff. So the first bite of, let's say, like a piece of cake that you eat, or the second or third bite may be really, really tasty. But as you eat more bites of a piece of cake or a piece of pizza, the enjoyment starts to decline. And we see that, of course, with technology. And I was like addicted to video games at some point. I would play a particular video game for 6 hours, 8 hours, and then I noticed I didn't even enjoy it anymore. So I would switch to a different video game. And that's the problem, right? You decided that you wanted to do something, but then your mind is like, yeah, I'm bored of this. So what I'm going to teach you is, instead of overcoming that tendency of the mind, overcoming the curiosity and tolerance of the mind, we're actually going to use the tendency of the mind to be bored to actually help us follow through. Which may sound impossible, but this is actually like sort of an evidence-based technique that works in addiction psychiatry. What we're going to learn how to do today is urge surf. So urge surfing is a technique that we use in addiction psychiatry to help people withstand the cravings to substances that they're addicted to. So I've used this very successfully in people who are addicted to things like alcohol and heroin and cocaine. And the general principle is that if we look at the mind, urges or cravings arise, but if we're able to tolerate that for some amount of time, if we're able to surf on top of the urge instead of give into it, over time, that urge will actually go away. And just think about it for a second, right? So our mind develops tolerance to particular things and gets bored of stuff. So if you have a particular urge or craving, over time, the mind will get bored of the urge or craving if you don't give in. So you may want, like, let's say a piece of pizza, but if you can't get it, let's say you're on an airplane and you want a fresh piece of pizza, you can't get a fresh piece of pizza on an airplane. So your mind wants the pizza for a little while, but do you spend 6 hours of a flight wanting that pizza over and over and over again? Of course not. Your mind naturally develops a tolerance to its own craving, and then it'll shift to something else. And cravings can be incredibly, incredibly intense. So I'm not saying that this is easy, but this is literally a technique that we can use in people whose brains are addicted to a substance. So their whole brain is aligned towards wanting this thing, and that's the only satisfaction that their brain is interested in. And yet urge surfing works. So paradoxically, all we're gonna do when we urge surf is, first of all, notice that you have the desire for something. And let's say, and this is what's kind of interesting, is if I'm trying to follow through with one task, what we really need to recognize is the desire to switch is a craving in and of itself. And so here's the thing to understand. When we're talking about follow through, what our mind essentially does is develop tolerance to the current activity and then craves a different activity. So if we sort of think about what follow through or why follow through is difficult, it's not so much that staying on task is hard. The real challenge is that our mind desires something else. And I invite you to just think about that for a second when you are struggling with following through. So it's not just that, okay, I started reading this book and it's hard to read it, but the question is, why is it hard to read it? It's because your mind would rather do other things. Oh, watching a TV show or checking something on social media or looking at memes or texting a friend or playing a video game or watching pornography. There are all kinds of other things that your mind craves rather than finishing the book. So what we really need to understand is that our mind's difficulty with following through actually has to do with cravings for other things. And the way that we manage those cravings is through urge surfing. So anytime that your mind wants to switch, that'll feel like a craving. And then what we want you to do is surf on top of it, right? So notice the urge arise within you. Notice the desire for your mind to do this, do that, do all those kinds of other things. And your mind wants you to give into it. It'll tell you all kinds of things. It'll say things like, oh, this is boring. It's a waste of time. We'll do it tomorrow. It'll use all kinds of different dialogue to try to trick you. But underneath all of that dialogue is a craving for something else, a craving for dopamine. And so what we want you to do is just surf on top of that urge. Notice the craving and just don't give into it, right? What we're asking you to do, remember that following through is about doing something consistently, but what y'all may be way better at is doing nothing, right? That's so much easier to do. It's not actually, because resisting a craving is difficult. But some of us are pretty good at doing nothing. We're pretty good at procrastinating, and that's what urge surfing really is. No cravings will last forever. That's a natural tendency of the mind, that no feelings will last forever. So joy from your wedding day does not last a lifetime. Joy from graduating does not last a lifetime. The heartbreak from a breakup or getting dumped, thankfully, does not last for a lifetime. And if we surf on that urge, what we'll find over time is that our mind will get bored of wanting something. And then instead of following through on switching tasks, our mind will naturally return to the thing that we want to do. And so paradoxically, the best way to follow through, if you struggle with like willpower, discipline, have low conscientiousness, is to just surf on top of the urge, just sort of tolerate that craving, and then kind of return back to the task. So there are a couple of things to consider. The first is that some of y'all may be saying, okay, well, but my cravings are really, really powerful, and this won't work for me because my cravings are really, really powerful. It's so hard to do. So notice what your mind is doing right there, right? Instead of actually trying the technique or even starting with something small, what does your mind do? It uses the one case where you're destined to fail. And it sort of says, no, don't even try this, right? Because don't even try this. It's not going to work. Notice what your mind is doing. It's even resisting the desire to try it. And that's what the mind does when you actually stumble upon a technique that will work with the mind. What it'll do is try to convince you as best as possible to not engage in it. The next thing to consider is that you don't have to start with the biggest craving, right? Because that's not what your mind says. Your mind just talks about the scenarios in which this won't work. It doesn't say, oh yeah, this may work for 25% of our cravings. This may work may help us follow through 25% more. What the mind naturally jumps to when it doesn't want to do something is the scenarios in which you'll fail. And the other thing to understand about urge surfing is it is a skill that is to be built up over time. So even if you think that your cravings are way too powerful, and I get you, right? I've worked with a bunch of people who have really strong cravings. I've struggled with them myself. There's some cravings that may be too hard to handle. You don't have to handle those. Let's just focus on the 25% that you can handle. And the last thing is, if you've made it to this point in the video, I want to invite y'all to pay attention to your desires to switch off of the video. I would bet that chances are over the course of this video, at some point your mind wanted to switch off. And notice how long that impulse lasted. So have you been struggling? Has this whole video been sort of a a long-term struggle with the desire to switch off of this video, if you really pay attention, what you've actually already done is urge surf. You've already had cravings to switch off to something else, maybe pull out your phone, or maybe you did pull out your phone. And what you'll notice, so I invite you to kind of pay attention to how you made it to the end of this video, because chances are you noticed the craving arose, and then the craving actually melted away. And that's urge surfing. And if you've made it this far, you've already done it. So all you need to do is just apply what you've already done today to the other dimensions of your life.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk. Pickaxe.
I want to talk to y'all today about why logic is not effective at treating depression. And this is a really important problem because a lot of people out there who struggle with depression or even subclinical depression, where they don't necessarily have a diagnosis, will struggle to pull themselves out of it. They'll analyze their situation and they'll recognize, okay, I need to do this or I need to do this, but they can't seem to, despite all the logic, bring themselves out of it. And on the flip side, we also have something incredibly scary, which is that sometimes when people are really, really depressed, or even things like suicidal, they're actually really logical about it. They sort of reach the logical conclusion that actually there's no reason for me to live right now, right? Because I've done the analysis, I don't have a bright future. Generally speaking, day to day, I suffer a lot. I'm in a lot of pain. The only bright points in my life are like these dopaminergic activities like gaming or porn or whatever. But like there's objectively no reason for me to be alive right now. And this is what's really challenging is if you try to talk to these people, you'll oftentimes find that their logic is actually really sound. And even in the cases when it's not really sound, you can try to convince them otherwise, but it seems like you sometimes hit a brick wall. And if you're struggling in this way, you may have noticed that you may try to argue against yourself, but your mind always comes to the same conclusion. So we're going to talk a little bit about, first of all, understanding what the relationship between depression and logic is, and also why it is that logic sort of doesn't work and what the real problem is with depression. Hey there, thanks for watching, and I'm glad these videos have been helpful. A lot of times I'll read the comments and see people asking, well, what do I actually do about it? Which is such a great question. And unfortunately, my experience has been that the resources out there aren't actually that good at helping people create sustainable change, which is why I started HG in the first place. HG coaches are trained on a curriculum that integrates all of my understanding into what is motivation, what paralyzes us, and how to create lasting behavioral change. So if you're ready to take the next step, HG coaches are ready to build the life that you want. They've helped people build careers, find relationships, build networks of friends, discover what their passions are, and pursue their hobbies. So if this sounds like something that you'd be interested in, check out the link in the description below. And so what we're going to talk about today is the relationship between logic, depression, and even IQ. And what we'll sort of discover is actually a little bit bizarre. First of all, not only is it that logic doesn't really work for depression, but the more intelligent you are or the more logical you are, there's a good chance that your depression will actually get worse. Not only does it not work, it's actually fuel for the fire. So let's start by understanding the relationship between IQ and depression. Because we tend to think about IQ as a positive thing, right? And this is sort of a situation where, like, generally speaking, the higher your IQ is, the easier life becomes. That's the way we sort of think about it, is that it's unilaterally a positive thing. But if we look at studies on IQ and depression, we discover something that's actually really bizarre, which is the higher your IQ is, the more likely you are to be depressed. So if you look at the general population, about 9.5% of people are depressed. There are some studies where researchers have looked at the top 2% of people in terms of IQ. So they took the smartest 2% of people in the world, and they assessed how depressed they are. And if you're in the top 2% of people, you have a 36.6% chance to be depressed. We're talking about a 4-fold increase in risk of depression. And that's like absolutely insane, right? Like how on earth does that work? Even though these studies have some methodological problems, there's some really interesting supporting evidence on sort of understanding why is it that smarter people are more likely to be depressed. So there's a series of trials that really look at something called insight, which is your awareness of what your problems are. So what they sort of discovered is that if you have a debilitating neurological disease, like let's say you've got like ALS, right, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, or it's like a degenerative nerve disorder. If you've got Parkinson's or something like that, if you get diagnosed with something that's like really bad, like cancer, the awareness that you have, your ability to analyze and accurately assess your situation correlates with suicidality. So the greater your insight is, the more aware you are, the more suicidal you are. There are also situations where they've looked at diseases like schizophrenia, and they've also found that like when you have people with schizophrenia, the more aware of the problem they are, the more damaging the situation actually is, and the more suicidal they become. So that sounds kind of weird, but like let's kind of dive into a little bit of like, why is that? Why is it that IQ can worsen depression and kind of like worsen suicidality and things like that? So let's start by understanding, first of all, what do we mean by logic? We start with a set of assumptions, and then we take those assumptions and then we can run some kind of analysis, and then we come to a conclusion. And generally speaking, the smarter you are, the more logical you will be, the more analytical you will be, and the more faith you will have in your analytical process. Because if you're smart and you are very good at logic, it becomes a useful tool, right? So we use logic to solve problems in life. And if logic comes to a particular conclusion, we trust that conclusion because it tends to work. So if I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I get a better grade? This is what I need to do. I can kind of logic it out and figure out what the right move is. If I'm having trouble at work, I can run through an analytical process and I can figure things out. And the higher your IQ is, the more likely you are to become dependent on logic. Now, let's take a look at depression. So there's a lot of really interesting neuroscience which helps us understand like what goes on in the brain of someone who's depressed. And as we understand what happens in the brain of someone who's depressed, we'll start to see how that can impact logic and even hijack it. So the first thing to understand about depression is I sort of think about it as the autoimmunity of mental illness. So if we look at autoimmune conditions, we have this thing called the immune system. And the purpose of the immune system is to fight off infections, right? These are the soldiers of our body. In autoimmunity, what happens is these soldiers start attacking us. So if you look at things like allergies, this is a situation where there's a benign particle, which we're inhaling, and our immune system is like, this is the enemy, let's attack it. In other cases of autoimmunity, we will actually attack our own tissues and cause things like rashes or inflammation or things like that. So what happens in depression? What happens in depression is our brain gets turned against us. So this is what's really terrifying, is the stronger our brain is, the worse the depression is. Because if you have a really powerful logical fallacy, but something in your brain has changed to always blame you or look at the negative or feel guilt or shame or whatever, it's going to leverage that brain against you. And this is why it's so hard to kick. So how does the brain actually do that? Let's understand a couple of things. The first thing in depression is we see that there is amygdalar hyperreactivity. What does that mean? So we have this part of our brain that senses threats and sort of detects negative things. When the amygdala is hyperreactive, it does a couple of interesting things. It changes our perceptions. So if there's a benign stimulus, if someone says, hey, I'm busy today, sorry, I can't meet, in the depressed brain, the amygdala being hyperreactive will interpret that in a negative way. So it alters our perceptions. We become hypersensitive to negativity. So even if someone says, hey, thank you so much for inviting me, I loved the meal that you cooked. It turns out, though, I wasn't able to enjoy the alcohol because I don't drink because of my religious beliefs. But I loved the appetizers. The fish was delicious. You have a lovely place. I had such an amazing time. And so if you look at that sort of experience, this is a statement where someone is saying, 5 or 6 positive things and 1 negative thing. They're not really blaming you for it. They're like, hey, I'm sorry I wasn't able to enjoy this thing. I just don't drink. And in the brain of a depressed person, that person will highlight that one piece of information. There actually is a cognitive filter that will knock out positive information and will actually amplify negative information. And this is all due to literally amygdalar hyperreactivity. As signals are coming into our body and our brain is literally ignoring like 90% of them and just focusing on the 10 most negative. The second thing that we have to understand about the brain, and this comes a little bit more from Eastern psychology, it's validated by Western studies, but I think the Eastern perspective is easier to understand, is we have to understand the relationship between emotions and analysis. So oftentimes when we're feeling emotional, we will try to logic ourselves out of it. We'll try to analyze our way out of it. But there's a really interesting feature of the brain, which is that when we are highly emotional, our emotions hijack our logic. So if you look at a political debate, these people are emotionally charged and they are both convinced that they are logically correct 100% of the time, right? And the more emotionally charged the debate becomes, the more sure someone is that they are thinking logical. You may have engaged in arguments with people where the person that you're arguing with is really, really emotional and not thinking clearly, but if you ask them, their perception is that they are perfectly logical. And let's be fair, if you're arguing, you're probably emotional and you're probably thinking that I am 100% right and they are 100% wrong. So we have to understand this really key relationship between emotions and analysis, which is that the more emotional we are, the more likely we are to actually hijack our analytical circuitry. And then the emotions are actually in control and they're pulling the strings of our logic. And we absolutely see this in depression as well. Now that we've understood a little bit about, okay, what's logic? We're sort of taking a set of assumptions. We have to start with axioms. We're doing some kind of analysis, and then we arrive at a conclusion. Great. In depression, we've got something that filters the information that we get. So it filters our inputs. And then we also see in depression that our emotions can hijack our analytical circuitry. What does this result in? So let's take a look at someone who has high IQ, who is very logical, and what that means for them if they end up depressed. So the first thing to understand is that if someone has a high IQ, there's a developmental component which we've got to dive into. So when I'm smart, if I'm a kid and I'm smart, I start to lean on logic more and more and more. So what we sort of see is that kids who are smart and are quite logical will use logic to solve their problems. It makes sense, right? So if I'm logical and if I'm smart, I'm going to use my intellect to solve problems. What that means, though, is that we tend to have underdeveloped faculties when it comes to emotional awareness and emotional processing. So if you look at kids who are very logical, they will use their logic to overcome their emotions. They will sort of set their emotions aside. They will sort of like suppress their emotions, and they'll approach things in a very cold and logical manner. That's just how we work. And the way that you can sort of think about this is if I grow up and I'm right-handed, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to like learn, oh, this is a Sharpie, so I don't want that to fall off. And I start writing with my left hand, what is going to happen to my capacity to use my left hand? The better I am at writing with my right hand, the worse I will get at writing with my left hand. So this is exactly what happens in development, is that if we have something that we're good at, we lean on that a lot to the exclusion of other things. Now let's compare that to a child who does not have super high IQ. So if they can't use their intellect to solve every problem, what do they have to do instead when they approach problems? They have to use some of these other things like EQ or emotional quotient. They develop more emotional awareness. They sort of work with other tools, right? So if I've got an S-class IQ, I'm going to just be owning things right and left with my S-class IQ. I'm not going to use my B-level emotional circuitry. And so over time, I don't even level that stuff up. So the first thing to understand is that kids who have a high IQ will sometimes, in a weird way, have a low EQ because they just don't have that emotional development. This may also explain, for example, like if you're a smart person who's very logically oriented, like you may notice that you have like some deficits. Like there's some things in life that seem really harder to you, which you know people who are not as smart as you are, and they seem to have no trouble with it. And you're like kind of confused, like why, if I'm so smart, why is this so easy for other people and so hard for me? And then you sort of result in some kind of conclusion, which is that like IQ can be a curse. But if you ever say that to people, they're like, lol, cry me a river, like IQ is a curse. Oh my God, you're so smart. You think you're so smart. Ah, lol, right? So like no one ever actually listens to that. But that's actually the case. It's really bizarre, but it's actually the case. The second thing, which y'all may have already figured out, is if we are using logic, but our amygdala is shaping our perceptions, what that means is the assumptions that I start with are flawed. And this is the core of the problem in people who are depressed and why logic doesn't work. It's because the assumptions are incorrect. So you can run that analysis as much as you want to, but the assumptions are where the problem is. because analysis and logic is completely separate from the faculty of perception, right? This is actually one of the things that I think is sort of missing in Western science. We don't really know how to fix cognitive biases or perceptions. We sort of focus on, once we have a particular belief, how do we work with that belief? We're sort of focused on logic, but we're not focused on perception. So the biggest challenge with people who are depressed, they're logically correct, but they're operating from the wrong assumptions. And that's not something you can't logic yourself out of your assumptions, or it's very difficult. What you really have to do is change your perception. So if you start getting new inputs, it will start to change some of your logic, and that's really what needs to happen. But this is the key problem with logic and depression, is that the information that you're starting with is fundamentally flawed and biased. So you can try to logic your way as many ways as you want. But if I give you a set of building blocks that is busted and can never build a house, there's no arrangement that you can put together that will result in a house. The last thing to keep in mind is we sort of talked a little bit about how emotions hijack logic. And this is the real problem of sort of the autoimmunity of depression. So once you reach a conclusion internally and emotionally that I am a bad person, or I will never be successful in life, once you lose faith in yourself, once you feel shame or guilt or hopeless, once that energy is there, it will hijack your logical circuitry. If someone feels hopeless, you can try to argue with them as much as you want to about, hey, here are the reasons you can live. Here's why you should believe in yourself. You can try to reassure them. You can try to convince. It doesn't work, because this is where the logic is actually being controlled by the emotion. And so what we really need to do is unpack that emotion or disarm that emotion, and then the logic will actually normalize by itself, and you'll feel a lot better. And this is the real tragedy of people who are smart, who struggle with depression, is that their ability to digest that emotion is underdeveloped, right? Because they've been smart their whole life, so they never developed emotional awareness. And in fact, half the people that I talk to who struggle with depression who are very smart, if I ask them, why are you depressed? They don't even mention an emotion. They don't say, I feel ashamed about myself. That's never what they say. They say, the reason that I'm depressed is because of this, 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 this. This is why my life is hopeless. I can logic it out to you. I can argue. I can convince you. This is truth. It's not emotion. It's actually the exact opposite. This is objective. It's not subjective. And why do these people believe that? Because their emotional awareness has been underdeveloped because they've relied on IQ their whole life. Now, if you've reached this point, you may be a little bit concerned. Does this mean I'm screwed, right? So does this mean, you were telling me, Dr. K, holy crap. So 9.5% of the population is depressed normally, and I use logic a lot, and my depression rate is 36.6%. That's scary. Also that the more I understand about life, the more suicidal I will become. That's scary. Does that mean I'm screwed? And this is the beautiful thing. Actually, absolutely not. And my experience as a clinician has been awesome, because when I work with patients who are smart, or I help people in general who are smart, so far the biggest problem is that their intelligence or logic is being leveraged against them. And amazing stuff can happen when your logic starts working in the right direction instead of trying to feed your hopelessness, which is what the logic does. It's amazing when you can really use it to tackle the hopelessness instead. And so what are the steps to that? So the first thing that we've got to do is understand that this is primarily driven by emotion. So when I work with these kinds of people, what I really focus on is building emotional awareness. And so the more that we build emotional awareness, then we can start tackling the emotions on their own. So we don't have to logic our way out of them. That's not really going to work. What we really have to do is validate and process those emotions. So this involves 3 steps. So this is awareness of emotions. So do you feel ashamed about yourself? What do you do with that feeling? I don't know what to do with it. I can't fix it, right? So I ignore it. And then I try to logic my way to success. So that's the exact problem, is you can't logic your way out of emotion. It's not really the way that the brain works. It's just not how we're wired. In fact, emotions can trump logic. It's usually not the other way around. So what we have to do is, first of all, recognize the emotions that we're feeling. The second thing that we have to do is oftentimes name them and really understand when we're feeling them. And the third and fourth things that we can try to do is tolerate them and process them. So this is where, when that emotional energy comes up, if we can tolerate it without reacting to it, it'll start to feed our logic a little bit less, okay? The next thing is, this is a beautiful thing, is if we can do emotional processing, then as the emotional energy decreases, the amount that it hijacks our logic will decrease. And if we're no longer hijacking our logic, then we can use logic to start helping us. But as long as logic is serving the master of hopelessness, it's not going to work. So how do you do this? This is where we've got some community events, like we did this Right in the Fields event, where we sort of helped thousands of people in our community build emotional awareness. Our coaches are also kind of familiar with that. But this is really where, if you're struggling with depression, I'd strongly recommend that you see a therapist, right? So because therapists are trained in this sort of emotional processing kind of stuff. The second thing that we can really do, and this is a little bit trickier, is work on our perceptions. So this is where, when we sort of look at like meditation, mindfulness, and yoga, we know that these things are effective at treating depression. And one of the key things that meditation, mindfulness, and yoga really do psychologically that we don't really do a whole lot in the West, is learn to purify our perception. So we have, for example, in Dr. K's guide, we've got a whole section on, how to purify your sensory organs. So how can you better receive information? How can you remove the cognitive biases that you have by sort of like removing the filters through which you get information? We also have Dr. K's Guide to Depression, which y'all can check out, where we dive into a lot of this kind of stuff. But this is where the short answer is, if you want to purify your perception, meditation, I think honestly, is like one of the best ways to do it. And if y'all can sort of add these two elements, what I've seen is a lot of progress. So when I worked with people, and I've worked with hundreds of people who are depressed, hundreds of people who are very capable and depressed, which is what makes it so confusing, right? So these are people like bankers at Goldman Sachs or CEOs of startups that are incredibly intelligent and incredibly capable and struggle with like crippling depression. And the reason is because they're missing some of these things. And if you sort of think about that, like, how can meditation help? So what we do with meditation is observe the breath. We're not judging it. We're not saying that breath is good or breath is bad, right? And sometimes I'll even do a practice with someone where I'll tell someone, bring in a food that you dislike and try that food and put it in, like, take a bite of the food and pay attention to where your dislike comes from. And inevitably what happens when people do this is that, oh, wow, this is not as bad as I thought. So what we're really doing in those moments is we're changing the way that our brain interprets stimuli. And the second thing that we do when I do therapy with people, right, and y'all may have seen this on stream, is we'll talk to people who are hopeless. And then we have a good cry. And after people have a good cry, they feel better. Their mind is calmer. Their logic starts to move a little bit better. That is emotional processing. So the other thing that you can kind of do is, by all means, like, use everything that we have available, go see a therapist. But the other thing you could do is just process those emotions. Like, you try journaling, or just have a good cry. Talk to someone about, hey, like, I'm really struggling right now and I really feel extra ashamed. And this is the other problem, is that the more intelligent you are and the more capable you are, the worse you feel about yourself for not being able to fix the problem. And that's the real tragedy, right? If you've got a high IQ and if you're very analytical, you've used this to fix so many things. And this is the one thing that you can't fix, and you should be able to fix it. And if you should be able to fix it, what does that mean? That means that you feel shame, because you should be able to do something and you're not able to do it, which in turn makes you stupid, right? Makes you worthless, makes you pathetic. And this is an example of how, if you kind of think about it, but hold on a second, what's going on here? We start with depression. I should be able to fix it. I'm not able to fix it. Therefore, I'm ashamed. Therefore, I'm worthless. What does that do? It feeds the emotion. So we've got to break that cycle by recognizing, okay, hold on a second. I feel ashamed of myself in the first place. How can I sit with that? How can I tolerate it? And how can I process it? So when it comes to logic and depression, it's a really common problem, because people who are very logical and very intelligent have actually used their logic and IQ to solve problems. The challenge is that when it comes to depression, this is a situation where we are turning our powerful logical ability, and the depression actually turns it against us. So it's not just that it doesn't help us so that it's ineffective. It's that actually logic and IQ can make depression worse. And there's scientific data that supports that. And so then the question becomes, okay, then what do we do about it? And this is where we have to develop our emotional awareness a little bit, develop our emotional processing, and also remove that cognitive filter. And as you're able to do these two things, your experience of feeling sad or some of this logic will actually start to get way better.
For more great podcasts, go to pickaxe.uk. Pickaxe.
Hey y'all, today we're going to talk about brain rot and how to fix it. So when I was working full-time as a psychiatrist, I noticed that people would come into my office and they would be like cognitively not in the best headspace. They would be sort of very lethargic. They would have difficulty focusing, difficulty motivating themselves. They couldn't really find direction, and anything was kind of hard for them to do. So when I was working with these people, I would develop what's called a differential diagnosis, which is let's see if we can figure out why there's a lack of focus, why there's a lack of motivation, why there's so much lethargy and a lack of energy. And sometimes this would be due to something like a physical or a mental illness. And we've covered that elsewhere in the channel. Increasingly, I saw more and more what's called brain fog. So brain fog is like a neuroinflammatory condition that causes like cognitive problems. So people who will have really bad COVID will sometimes have this post-COVID syndrome that's characterized by brain fog. But that was sort of another sort of thing that we've also covered elsewhere. And by the way, apparently is one of our best YouTube videos. So check it out if you think that that could be happening with you. Hey, just a quick note. A lot of people will ask us, what do I do next? And that's why we built Dr. K's Guide. It's a comprehensive resource that distills over 20 years of my experience, both as a monk and as a psychiatrist. And it's designed in a way that's tailored to fit your needs. So if you're interested in better understanding your mind and taking control of your life, check out the link below. But the third and sort of devastating thing is sometimes you couldn't blame brain fog and you couldn't blame a mental illness. And these were people whose brains had just kind of like rotted from like engaging in the wrong kinds of crap for like years or even decades. And this is kind of what I call brain rot. And what I sort of discovered is that these were people